One is a gradual increase in CO2. There's also a seasonal cycle in CO2. And one thing about CO2 is it has a long atmospheric lifetime, so it's well mixed in the atmosphere. So this measurement is a good approximation of global mean CO2. So global CO2 is fluctuating by the seasons, and the units here are parts per million of CO2. All right. Now, the seasonal cycle is seen more clearly in this slide. The third figure, the bottom right, shows that the CO2 concentration is maximum in May to July. That is in the northern summer. And the reason for this is photosynthesis. As you all know, photosynthesis takes up CO2 from the atmosphere, and there's much more vegetation. If you look at a map of global vegetation, global land area, you'll see there's a lot more land area, there's a lot more vegetation in the northern hemisphere, there's a lot more photosynthesis in the northern hemisphere. And as a result, during... Yes?
You are in slide number 3, and possibly you were describing slide number 4, right?
Yeah, I'm describing this slide. Yeah, the bottom right.
Fourth slide you were discussing, or third?
Yeah, the fourth slide. Yeah, the fourth slide.
But you're projecting third slide.
I'm projecting the third slide. Okay. Now, can you see the fourth slide? Can you see the slides changing?
For me, no.
Okay. Anyone else? Can they see slide number 4?
Yeah, we
Ashwin, I am able to see slide 4.
Okay.
I can see slide 4.
Okay, maybe it is my problem. Yeah,
okay. So I'll just pause for a few seconds so you can refresh. But I'm showing slide 4, which is an amplification of slide 3. I'm just zooming into slide 3. All right. So what slide 4 shows on the top right is a few years of the Mauna Loa curve. What you see in slide 3 is 1960, actually 1958 to 2021 CO2. You see the seasonal cycle. You see CO2 going up. On the top right of slide 4, you see this zoomed in for a few years, 2016 through 2022. And in the third figure in slide 4, you see just 1 year. Okay, 1 year where you see the seasonal cycle. CO2 is largest in May, June, July. And the reason for that is the seasonal cycle of photosynthesis. All right, so since there's much more plant growth, there's much more vegetation in the northern hemisphere, there's obviously more, and this drives CO2 down in the months of August, September, October, November, and so on. Whereas in the northern winter, you have less photosynthesis, and this drives CO2 up in the months of October, November, December, and so on. Okay, so I should point out that there have been many, many studies of the seasonal cycle of CO2, but I will draw your attention to the main effect, which is an increase over time. And for our purposes, it's the curve on the left of slide 4, which is also the curve that you see in slide 3, that is pertinent. Now, the increase in atmospheric CO2 is directly related to global warming, and this is a figure from the recent IPCC report. The 6th assessment, and the black curve shows the instrumental record. Let me turn on my pointer. This is the black curve. It's the instrumental record, and it has been compared with climate model simulations. The shading shows the uncertainty, and as Professor Srinivasan discussed yesterday, climate models differ in their simulations of the CO2 effect. And you see 2 bands in the figure, right? And these show the resulting intermodal uncertainty in the simulation of the CO2 effect in brown, CO2 and other climate forces in brown, and the green band is where the climate models have been run with natural forcing. The brown band has natural forcing and anthropogenic forcing. And clearly none of the models can reproduce the instrumental record without anthropogenic forcing. Now, here's another diagram from the report, which shows contributions to warming. The present warming as compared to the second half of the 19th century, the 1850 to 1900. Remember, CO2 emissions began, anthropogenic CO2 began in earnest in the mid-1800s, but really they started to take off in the 1900s. And so you don't see much warming in the second half of the 19th century, and that's why this is the reference period relative to which warming in 2010 to 2019 has been compared by the IPCC. And the present warming is about just over 1 degree Kelvin. The IPCC has also examined how much different types of climate forcing agents contribute to this, and that's shown in the panel on the right. Okay, so this is the total human influence, which is just equal this estimate a bit over 1 Kelvin. Well-mixed greenhouse gases have the largest contribution to this, with CO2 factor, which is partly compensated by cooling by other. Role of CO2 has meant about how to limit climate change. Most recently at the COP26 that was held earlier this month, and here's a diagram showing how rapidly emissions reductions must begin quite quickly, and they must come down to net zero. Now, to understand all of this, we must begin with the global carbon cycle schematic. The blue colors show the stocks or pools of carbon in the Earth system, while red colors show the flows or fluxes. Does everyone understand the difference between pool carbon? Fluxes are basically the rates of change of the pools. Okay, how much does the pool change, the pool of carbon change per year? A petagram, that is 10 to the power 15 grams, so PG is petagrams, 10 to the power 15 grams of carbon, not CO2, but 10 to the power 15 grams is 1 billion tons. So a petagram is the same as a gigaton, right? Petagram, the same units. Now, what do we notice? We notice, I'll point a couple of things. We're going to spend a bit of time on the slide. I'll just point you to the major things I draw your attention to. The atmosphere has 750 billion tons of carbon, right? That's here. Remember, the stocks are in blue, the flows are in red, with the corresponding arrows showing the direction of flow. So the atmosphere has 750 billion tons of carbon, right? 750 petagrams, a petagram is equivalent to 1 billion ton. The surface ocean has roughly the same amount. Okay, 725 petagrams, while the rest of the global oceans, right, the intermediate and the deep oceans, have 50 times as much carbon. A large amount resides in fossil fuels, while there is much, much more in the Earth's crust. The vast majority of Earth's carbon is stored in the crust. Now, let's look at the fluxes, which are listed in the red color. Each year, there are parts of the ocean that give out CO2 to the atmosphere, and there are parts of the ocean that take up CO2. CO2 dissolves in seawater, and the flux between ocean and atmosphere is driven by the difference in these concentrations. So I want you to note one thing. The ocean-atmosphere flux, the incoming ocean are both large, right? Ocean loss is 90 petagrams, ocean uptake is 92. Okay, but the difference is small. But a bit more is taken up by the oceans. A little more is in ocean uptake than is in ocean loss. The difference is 2 petagrams of carbon. This is due to the imbalance created by fossil fuel emissions. So there's fossil fuel emissions. When this figure was made, it was about 10, 12 years back, it was about 7.7 petagrams of carbon of fossil fuel emissions per year entering the atmosphere, right? From burning, anthropogenic burning of fossil fuel emissions. Now the figure is closer to 10. Note also that CO2 taken up by the atmosphere by photosynthesis, taken up from the atmosphere by photosynthesis, that's 120 petagrams of carbon, is about balanced by plant and soil respiration. Plant respiration is 59, soil respiration is 58. Right? The difference is 3. So there's 3 more petagrams taken up by the biosphere than is given out by respiration, either by plants or the soil. And this difference is about 40% of the emissions in the diagram, 40% of the 7.7 anthropogenic burning emissions in the diagram. Land use change puts out some CO2, although the estimate is very uncertain. All right, that's here, 1.1. So there's a lot of uncertainty in this number. And volcanoes put out a small amount. CO2. 0.1 petagrams of carbon per year. Which is about 1% of anthropogenic emissions. And in addition, a small fraction, 0.01 petagrams, which is 0.1%, is buried in sediments each year. And this, how does this occur? It occurs when CO2 basically dissolves in rainwater to form a weak acid. And this dissolves rocks on the surface of the earth in a process called rock weathering. And this takes CO2 out of the atmosphere. But it's a very slow process, right? It would take 1,000 years for the annual emissions of CO2 to be buried by rock weathering. So in summary, what we see are the following. We see fast processes with large fluxes. We see slow processes, right, with much smaller fluxes that occur over much longer timescales that are natural. And these exchange CO2 between the different reservoirs. We see small reservoirs, large reservoirs. Slow processes of volcanoes and rock weathering. Fast processes involve photosynthesis, respiration, and air-sea exchange, right? Exchange between the atmosphere and the surface ocean. Now, the fast processes are shown in this diagram. I think it's helpful to look at this figure as well, because the numbers in red show how much the fluxes, so only fluxes are shown. Well, there are some stocks as well, but only the fluxes are highlighted in color. The stocks are in white, I believe. But the numbers in red show how the anthropogenic cycle has perturbed the carbon cycle, right? How much these fluxes have been modified by human emissions. So for example, air-sea exchange, and here you see human emissions are a bit larger because this diagram was made when human emissions had increased compared to the previous figure. And you see that air-sea exchange would be in balance, right? 90 going out, 90 coming in, if it were not for the 9 petagrams of fossil fuel emissions. So you have 2 extra petagrams of uptake by CO2 by the surface ocean. Similarly, photosynthesis would be in balance with respiration, right? 60 plus 60, so microbial respiration 60 plus plant respiration 60 would be in balance with the 120 taken up by the biosphere in photosynthesis, if it were not for the fact that anthropogenic emissions gives rise to accelerated photosynthesis and leads to 3 petagrams of additional uptake of CO2 by the biosphere. Okay, in summary, I'll just summarize the main messages. There are fast and slow processes in the carbon cycle, which have to be modeled and are included in some respect. The main fluxes are included in some respect in Earth system models, which represent the carbon cycle. Fast processes involve uptake of CO2 by the surface ocean, as well as by the biosphere, that is trees and vegetation. Slow processes is mainly the weathering of rocks, as well as a slow transfer of CO2 from the surface to the deep ocean. And about half of CO2 ends up in one of these reservoirs. Any questions at this point? Okay. Is my voice audible now? Question about the fast carbon cycle. Am I audible now?
Ashwin, you're audible, but you are fluctuating. Is your mic in front of you or it's somewhere else? Because it's fluctuating, your voice.
Is this better? Am I more audible now?
Yes, but I think you move your head, maybe it fluctuates. I don't know why.
Okay, how about now?
Okay, now continue. I'll let you know if there's a problem.
Okay, yeah, please do. So there was a question about the fast carbon cycle. Yeah. So these are the processes, right? So what are the fluxes involved in the fast carbon cycle? There's photosynthesis, there's respiration, there's air-sea exchange. Okay. These are all the fluxes that are large. Right? So there's exchange of CO2 between the atmosphere and surface oceans. There's exchange of CO2 between the atmosphere and the biosphere. So plants take up CO2 in photosynthesis, they respire, and they give out CO2. If it weren't for human emissions, photosynthesis and respiration would be in balance. If it weren't for human emissions, the parts of the ocean, some parts of the ocean would over long stretches of time take up more CO2, and some parts of the ocean would over long stretches of time give out more CO2, and these would be in balance. Of course, there's year-to-year variability, right? Even without human intervention, there's year-to-year variability. In some years, the ocean would give out more CO2, in some years, the ocean would take back more CO2, but on average, 90 would balance. 90 balance 90 going out from the ocean. All right. This contrasts with the slow carbon cycle, which involves a very slow burial to sediments, right, and a very slow volcanic process, which puts out CO2 into the atmosphere. Does that answer your question? If deforestation land use is happening, there is less green cover. Yeah. So that's a good question, right? So this is a big source of uncertainty in this part of the carbon cycle. 1.1. So the distinction is between, okay, so I think your question is the following, right? Deforestation and land use is happening, so the biosphere is taking up less CO2. How do you have then more in photosynthesis? Is that the question? Assuming that's your question, right? So the existing plants, the existing biosphere is sensitive to the amount of CO2 levels in the atmosphere. Okay, and they respond to more CO2 by growing. Okay, this is called carbon fertilization. And so there's more photosynthesis, they take up more CO2. But for carbon budgeting purposes, the distinction is made between how the biosphere responds through photosynthesis versus how much biosphere there is to take up CO2, right? And that is this part, deforestation and land use change. So best estimates at the time of this writing were that deforestation and land use change is giving CO2 out to the atmosphere, but we don't know exactly how much, right? And therefore this number, this 1.1, is very uncertain. Have I answered your question? Okay. All right, let's continue. And overall, there's an important consequence of all of this dynamics, which is that the fraction of anthropogenic CO2 that is accumulated in the atmosphere, instead of being taken up by one of these reservoirs, has remained nearly constant. And so here's a diagram from the recent IPCC report, the 6th assessment report, which shows this. It's from chapter 5 on the carbon cycle, which you can read for more information on this topic. And there's a lot going on in this figure, but I want to focus on a basic message that about half, actually about 44%, which is this line which shows the average of CO2 emissions has remained in the atmosphere. This is called the airborne fraction. It's what fraction of CO2 emissions remains in the atmosphere at a given time. And the very simple explanation for this, so if you look at the average, the 5-year running mean or the long-term average, and you also see the fluctuations are not a whole lot different, right? The 5-year running mean gives you a picture that's different from the annual picture, but it tells you that on average, you have this figure, roughly 50% of CO2 emissions remains in the atmosphere. And there's a very simple explanation for this. It's roughly half of all emissions are taken up quickly by the biosphere and by the surface ocean. If you look here, right? About half of all the emissions, you have 9, you have 3 here, and you have 2 here. So about half of all emissions, so out of this 9, 3 and 2 are taken up by the biosphere as well as by the surface oceans due to enhanced photosynthesis as well as due to increased air-to-sea gas exchange. All right. And again, this number varies from year to year, but on average, this number is quite well understood. And the additional fact is that the rest takes a long time to be taken up by these slow processes, right? So then the fast carbon cycle, so in other words, the fast carbon cycle, that's this 3 and this 2, takes up about 50% of the 9, and the slow carbon cycle takes a very long time to operate, right? Because the fluxes are very small, as you see here, right? The burial to sediments is 0.01. All right, the transfer from the surface ocean to the deep ocean, which is not shown here, is also very, very slow. So since the fast carbon cycle takes up about 50%, and the slow carbon cycle takes a really long time to act, about 50% of the CO2 emissions are airborne at any given time. Okay, so here are some milestones in the history of our topic. In the 1800s, it not only was the greenhouse effect recognized, but also in the 1890s, Arrhenius made the first estimate of the CO2 greenhouse effect. A lot had to happen between then and the first calculations of Manabe that Professor Srinivasan described to you yesterday. In 1938, and this is relevant to our story, a chemical engineer named Callender suggested, based on temperature measurements, and we'll see a figure illustrating this, based on temperature measurements made until then, he suggested that the climate had been warming in the past few decades, and he attributed this to CO2. And remember, Arrhenius had already pointed out that CO2 could warm the Earth. Callender, by contrast, pointed out that it had already been warming the Earth 40 years later. All right. It turned out that he was premature in his conclusion, and you can see other developments on this slide that became crucial to later developments in climate modeling, such as the finding by Gilbert Plas that CO2 would affect the radiation balance. Another important aspect of our story is the finding by Roger Revelle that CO2 does not readily mix with the ocean. And this is a very interesting story, and many of you would enjoy reading about it. This happened in the 1950s. At first, using measurements of the time taken by radioactive carbon, radioactive isotope of carbon from nuclear tests to enter the surface ocean, they estimated, he and his colleagues estimated that the lifetime of a CO2 molecule in the atmosphere would be about 10 years. So it takes 10 years for a radioactive carbon molecule from nuclear weapons tests to enter the ocean from the atmosphere. So then they thought, okay, it'll take about 10 years for CO2 to dissolve into the ocean. It doesn't look like much, but later they found out that much of that CO2 that entered the ocean would be returning to the atmosphere, right? So what were they doing? They looked at only one half of this, right? So it turns out that the difference between the 90 that goes in and the 90 that comes out is 2, which is very small, right? The net flux to the ocean, 2, is very small. And more importantly, over time, they found out that it's also important to understand not just how rapidly CO2 enters the ocean, but also how it goes from the surface ocean to the deep ocean, right? So from our carbon budget, we saw that the surface of the ocean atmosphere are exchanging almost equal amounts of CO2, and the difference is small. And moreover, the question is not how long it takes for CO2 to enter the surface ocean, but how quickly that is taken up by the deep ocean. And it turns out that is very slow. Okay, that process is very slow. And so all of this was started by folks such as Revelle who in the 1950s started to look at atmosphere-ocean exchange of CO2 and realized then that the problem was much more complicated than they'd initially set out to understand. And so we'll see a related problem in today's tutorial. But coming back to our history, all of this led to Manabe's first calculation of the CO2 greenhouse effect. And more recently, over the last 20 years, studies have shown, studies on the atmospheric carbon cycle have led to the finding that even if we were to stop all CO2 emissions now, it would take a very long time for the CO2 that is already in the atmosphere to reduce to the point where global warming comes down. Okay, so that's a paper we're going to take a look at now in the next slide. But I should also point out that in 2008, around the year 2000, and over the last 20 years, there's been a lot of work that has shown revealed the complexity of the terrestrial carbon cycle. All right, so it's showing, for example, that it might make it harder for soils and forests to take up carbon. So what does that mean? It means that there's a lot of uncertainty in this number, right? So if we continue to emit about 10 gigatons a year, for instance, gigatons of carbon a year, will this number continue to be 3 or will it come down, for instance, right? And as atmospheric CO2 will go up, would you expect the carbon fertilization effect to go up? Do you expect this number to rise, or are there intrinsic limitations? So there's a lot going on in the carbon cycle. I'm just going to move on in the story and point out the paper from 2008, which is well worth studying if you're interested in atmospheric CO2. And the author's note in the abstract, and let's quote, "The notion is pervasive in the climate science community and in the public at large that the climate impacts of fossil fuel CO2 release will only persist for a few centuries. This conclusion has no basis in theory or models of the atmosphere-ocean carbon cycle, which we review here. The largest fraction of the CO2 recovery would take place on timescales of centuries as CO2 invades the ocean, but a significant fraction of the fossil fuel CO2, ranging in published models in the literature from 20 to 60%, remains airborne for 1,000 years or longer. Okay, ultimate recovery takes place on timescales of hundreds of thousands of years, a geologic longevity typically associated in public perceptions with nuclear waste. So putting CO2 in the atmosphere means that a large fraction of it remains in the atmosphere for a really long time. Okay. This is one of the important challenges of mitigation, having to contend, with the long-lived nature of CO2 in the atmosphere. Simply because a large fraction of CO2 would remain, the world emits, would remain in the atmosphere for millennia. That's the timescales we're thinking about, several millennia. So here's a figure from that paper. The upper panel is emissions of CO2. Right now, the world is emitting about 10 gigatons of CO2. Sorry, 10 gigatons of carbon per year. What one sees is that for two very different scenarios in the top panel, it takes a very long time for CO2 concentrations to decrease, even after you bring down emissions to zero. Okay, even after 10,000 years, a large fraction of CO2 remains in the atmosphere, and which is what you see in the middle panel, right? Even after 10,000 years, a large fraction of the CO2 that remains in the atmosphere. The maximum CO2 here is about 1,800 part per million in this scenario, and it doesn't come down to 50% of that figure for over 10,000 years. What you see in the bottom panel is that even after 10,000 years, a large fraction of the warming effects persist. Right? So because of the long atmospheric lifetime of CO2, it takes a long time for the warming to reduce, global warming effect to reduce, as the CO2 is reduced. It might not be so obvious on this graph, but if you look closely, you will also notice that the CO2 cycle is nonlinear. It turns out that the fraction of CO2 that remains in the atmosphere. So I'll share the slides with you and you can pour at it at your leisure, and you'll see that the fraction of CO2 that remains in the atmosphere after 10,000 years is higher for the scenarios with more CO2 emissions. Right? So the fraction that remains after 10,000 years divided by the peak concentration is larger as you increase the CO2 emissions. Okay, and so several studies have looked at these kinds of things, looked at the time it takes for CO2 to be absorbed by these slow components of the carbon cycle, because by this time the fast components have already done their job, and then it takes a really long time for the slow components to work, and those processes are non-linear. So the more you put CO2 in the atmosphere, the longer the effective time scale is. Right? The longer the effective lifetime is, the longer it takes for the slow component to do its job and reduce and draw down CO2 from the atmosphere. And so there's a large body of work that discusses not just the carbon cycle and the science behind it, but also the implications for global warming and mitigating global warming. Another implication of long-lived CO2 is that global warming depends on cumulative emissions, that is total emissions across time. And here's an illustration of this in a simple energy balance climate model. And on the left, you have simple emission scenarios, right? Emissions versus time. On the right, you have global warming versus cumulative emissions. That's the integral of the emissions curve. So cumulative emissions is basically the area under the emissions curve at a given time, right? So cumulative emissions at the year 2100 in this scenario will be the area under the corresponding curve. And so how much have we emitted from pre-industrial times until the present? And we see that the curves on the right line, right, that's global warming is independent of cumulative emissions. Sorry, independent of the scenario and depends only on cumulative emissions. And this has implications as described by the IPCC, which is that the ratio of global mean surface temperature change to total cumulative emissions is relatively constant and independent of the scenario. And for any given temperature target, higher emissions in earlier decades therefore imply lower emissions by the same amount later on. Right? Why is that? Because for carbon dioxide, global warming is a function of cumulative emissions. And this, as we shall see, is another implication of the long atmospheric lifetime of CO2. And this is essentially why we talk about cumulative emissions budgets. So this relationship between global warming and emissions does not depend on the emissions pathway, and the reason for that is basically the long atmospheric lifetime of CO2. And here again, we'll adopt the same trick of making models simulate something that we know to be wrong in order to study the effects. So the question is, what if we make CO2 have an atmospheric lifetime of 12 years, like that of methane? And the answer is then, for the same emission scenarios on the left, we obtain the plots on the right? So you plot global warming versus cumulative emissions. You see two things. First, warming is much smaller than it would be if CO2 had a longer atmospheric lifetime. So here you see the warming effect of CO2 is a function of its lifetime. Since the same amount of CO2, if it lasts longer, which it does, it has a radiative forcing for a longer period of time and therefore warms the Earth more. So if we were to incorrectly, for our purposes, make CO2, force CO2 to have the atmospheric lifetime of methane, you're not going to get the same warming effect that you did in the previous graph. But the other effect is that CO2 has a much shorter lifetime, and therefore the relation between global warming and emissions is not independent of the pathway. Right? So for climate forces with the lifetime of methane, we would not compare emissions simply by looking at their total emissions across time. So let's return to our history. But before that, I can take any questions that you may have. Are there any questions? Yeah, there's a question, right? What about respiration by animals? That's a very interesting question. So I think this is part of a broader question, right? So there's a lot of waste heat produced. So you can think about respiration, our respiration needs in terms of our energy needs, right? And so there have been calculations of global energy consumption, right? Fossil fuel energy consumption, both electricity and fuels and other ways. And think of it this way. We respire to serve our energetic needs, right? But we use fossil fuels at a much larger scale. So the amount of CO2 that we release from respiration is much smaller, but you also have to ask questions about the effects of energy consumption, right? So when we consume fossil fuel energy, we emit waste heat, and all these effects, both human respiration, animal respiration, as well as the effects of waste heat generated through our energy consumption, are much smaller than the radiative forcing effect, right? So if you were to compute how much CO2 we release or animals release in animal respiration, the effects would be much smaller. Does that answer your question?
Ashwin, can I interfere here?
Yes.
This question has been asked many times by faculty in IISc. I think the main issue is really, if all animals and human beings do not use fossil fuel resource, then respiration is a part of the natural carbon cycle. It is not a CO2 net emitter. If all human beings only eat food not from fossil fuels, but from natural sources, then you are a part of the natural carbon cycle. So you are not counted. For example, there are 7 billion human beings in the world today. We don't count their emission of CO2 because we do not consider the fact we should, but we do it separately. For example, today they're saying agriculture contributes 30% to CO2. That's because of use of fossil fuels. If agriculture did not use fossil fuels and we lived a natural life like we lived for 10,000 years, then our respiration doesn't count. So does the animal.
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
Yes, yes.
So the only issue is the use of fossil fuels in our energy system. Then you are in trouble. If you are going to use fertilizer for growing food, then you use fossil fuels, right? If you use a natural fertilizer, then you don't use fossil fuels. So as a matter of fact, since the issue has been raised, I would like all the students to sit down and calculate how many gigatons of CO2 does human being release in respiration. calculate that. It's a very interesting exercise. Okay. And then you can do for all the animals. Animals are much more if you count all the rats, all the other animals. But start with human beings whose population we know quite well. So human beings 7 billion. Human beings 7 billion. You can look up any Google search for how much CO2 we emit per day. You can get the data, multiply into 365 into number of human beings. It is not a small number, but it is considered a part of the natural cycle as long as your eating habits are not related to fossil fuels. Ashwin, I'm sorry to have interrupted.
No,
okay,
that's helpful. I'm thinking about your answer, Professor Jay. So you're saying that, so is this related to the fact that if we were not reliant on fossil fuels, we will be bound by energetics, and therefore the respiration will be much lower than what would occur?
No. Respiration is same. If you are consuming plant, for example, let me take simply a vegetarian. If you're a vegetarian, you are eating the carbon fixed by plants and releasing it back almost the same year. So there is no accumulated carbon issue at all here. You are eating fruits, plants of that year, which are fixed by the plants that year, and you are releasing it that year. Over, there's no problem. But if you take fossil fuels out from deep in the earth 100 million years ago and releasing it 100 times faster, then that's a big issue.
Right.
That's why if you look at the agriculture CO2 emission, it is all related to fossil fuels. When people say agriculture, say 30%, it's the way meat is produced in America and South America, North America, in huge farms, in which a lot of fossil fuel is used in the whole process, transport and everything. If that is not there, there is no question of treating respiration of all living beings as being a source of CO2. It cannot be. It's a part of the natural cycle.
That's right, yeah.
As a matter of fact, I can tell you, I've had any number of arguments with my colleagues in IISc who were making fun of IPCs and so on. They're saying you guys are not counting human respiration, so your whole argument is wrong. And it takes a lot of time to convince them that we do take into account that part of human activity which is done through fossil fuels, food or anything, but not which is part of a natural cycle. To me, respiration is the natural cycle of all living beings, and if we all lived only on non-fossil sources of carbon, then we are not putting out any extra CO2 into the atmosphere in that year.
Right.
Okay.
But you know,
this was debating. Actually, what really is a good point raised by the student. It's what everyone to think about it, because not many are convinced by this argument, but I think they should now look at the pre-fossil fuel world and the post-fossil fuel world. In the pre-fossil fuel world, CO2 did not change up to 1850, because whatever respiration was going on, alcohol population was lower, of course, did not affect the CO2. It's only in the post-fossil fuel world we have this problem.
Right. There would be an analogous balance as the respiration photosynthesis balance between the biosphere and atmosphere. But can anybody tell us what the number is? How much do the humans respire per year? And how much so if you think about, right now, globally, we're estimating 10 gigatons of carbon per year. It's about 44 gigatons of CO2 per year. That's 10 billion tons for roughly 7.5 billion people. So roughly 1 billion ton of carbon, not CO2, 1 ton of carbon, right? So about 4.4 tons of CO2 per person per year. And so I think all of you can go back and do the calculation. How much does this compare with respiration? And yes, I mean, I think the challenge is really we're emitting a lot more that's not coming back, right? So we're emitting, let's go back to the slide. We're emitting this 9 gigatons per year, only 5 of which is being taken up by natural reservoirs. And obviously, this is a much larger perturbation to the carbon cycle than before the fossil fuel era, right? So I think it'll be useful. I think so. I really like Professor Jace's comments on this. I think it'll be useful though to do the calculation of how much we emit and try to understand where it goes, right? So where, if it's an equilibrium, if we respire a certain number of CO2 per year, what is that number and where does it come from? Professor Jace, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think as a matter of fact, students can do a Google search and find out the kind of answers given in Google search. There are interesting answers there, but they must independently calculate and be convinced that it is not small, but it is if everybody eating only natural meat and natural what do you call plants, then they are not contributing to the net CO2 of that year. They should get convinced on that. Okay.
Okay. So I think there are some comments. The average person in the US emits about 27 tons of CO2 per year, right? And that's fossil fuel carbon. So 27 tons of CO2 would be CO2. I think that would amount to about less than 10 tons of carbon per year, right? The world average is just over 1 ton. So there's a factor of 10 difference, right? So the world average is just over so 10 gigatons of carbon divided by roughly 7.5 billion people. So just over a gigaton, one ton of carbon per year. And somebody has said the average person in the US emits about 27 tons of CO2 per year. But all of that is fossil fuel. Question is, how much do we emit by respiration and where does that, right? So the carbon goes out and obviously there are energy inputs into plant growth and so on. So where does that come in, right? How is that balanced out? So Dharma says 25 gigatons per year if we take 1 kg per day per person by emissions. Okay. Okay, so let's discuss this more in the tutorials. I think this is an interesting exercise for us to discuss. Okay, we'll come back to it, but please remind us and we'll come back to this question. Okay, so where were we? In the 1970s, this effect was noticeable. The CO2 effect was noticeable. The thin dashed line that you see here, let me turn on my pointer. The thin dashed line, right? This line is natural variability. The dots show the CO2 effect, and the thick dashed line is the total effect, the sum of the two. And at this time, in the 1970s, the CO2 effect was quite substantial. It was the same magnitude as a warming signal from observations and much larger than the natural variability. Of course, you should remember that the sign of the natural variability differs a lot. But 40 years earlier, remember from our earlier discussion, Callender had pointed out that the CO2-induced warming was already underway. That's out here. And so what he had observed is the effects of natural variability. So here's a quote from several newspapers at that time in the 1970s. The world may be inching into a prolonged warming trend that is the direct result of burning more and more fossil fuels. CO2 may be the world's biggest environmental problem, threatening to raise the world's temperature. A poll of climate scientists is evenly divided on warming or cooling, but the leading experts strongly expected future warming. All scientists agree that a new factor has entered a game of climate change, a wild card never there before. This was the 1970s, right? All of these reports are from the 1970s. But despite this, the discussion about whether the greenhouse effect was upon us continued well into the 1980s. And this is because although the carbon cycle and the effect of CO2 on climate were beginning to be well understood, scientists had just begun modeling internal climate variability. And so here's a quote from an article in 1988. No one type of change is likely to convince the scientific community of the reality of the greenhouse effect or its true magnitude until well into the next century, when the world would be condemned to dramatic changes. The best bet for early detection seems to be identification of a number of changes: warmer weather, warmer ocean water, a cooler stratosphere, increased precipitation, for example, that together would, in all likelihood, be caused by a greenhouse And the approach now being pursued is more like developing a composite picture of a culprit rather than arresting the first suspect who has the same color eyes. This is the idea of fingerprinting. So you learned yesterday that Manabe identified some of the first fingerprints of CO2-induced warming in the 1970s. Examples of fingerprints at that time that were believed to be promising included looking at cooler stratosphere and, of course, warmer temperatures and warmer oceans and so on to distinguish the CO2 effect from other effects. Scientists knew what a fingerprint might look like, but there was no objective method to identify what a fingerprint was. Okay, and this is where the work of Klaus Hasselmann comes in. He shared the Nobel Prize in Physics this year for doing some of the foundational work in the area of fingerprinting, and he basically showed how to identify, objectively these fingerprints. And this is a figure from an article he wrote in the top in 1979. In it, he did not use the language of fingerprinting. At that time in the 1970s, climate scientists knew what a fingerprint might look like, but did not call it that, right? They did not use the language of fingerprints, and they didn't have a way to find it from models either. So Hasselmann showed that the fingerprint corresponds to maximizing signal to noise ratio. Noise here corresponds to natural variability of climate. So the best, so if you look at the figure in the top right, it's one thing about, so Hasselmann's papers are very foundational, but they don't have a lot of figures, but this is the one figure from the 1979 paper. And it shows that the best signal to noise direction, that is B hat, would be some combination of a strong signal and a weak noise, right? So G is where the signal is strong, but along G, the noise is also strong. So where the length of the ellipse, right, where this line cuts the ellipse, if that length is long, it means the noise is long. And he showed how to maximize the signal to noise ratio. And he said the best detection would not necessarily correspond to the direction of the signal, especially if that direction also has a lot of noise, right? If there's a lot of variability. So you won't detect a CO2 signal in places where there's also a lot of natural variability. You will detect a CO2 signal in places where the natural variability is less. It'll be some combination of where the CO2 signal is strong, where CO2 has a large effect, and where natural variability is small. And in '93, he developed this insight into the first optimal fingerprinting paper. And the question is, how do we find a fingerprint? For example, the fingerprint of the CO2 effect on climate. And his answer is as follows. The optimal fingerprint depends on the signal pattern, but also on the inverse covariance matrix of noise. This is basically variability, right? It measures variability. And so it's quote, an optimal filter is derived for the detection of a time-dependent multivariate climate change signal in the presence of natural climate variability noise. Application of the fingerprint to the observed climate data yields a climate change detection variable with maximum signal to noise ratio. The optimal fingerprint is given by the product of the assumed signal pattern and the inverse of the climate variability covariance matrix. So here, what does this mean in plain language? The covariance matrix measures variability. Covariance matrix is small, where the variability is small, and where the covariance matrix is small, the inverse is large, right? And the inverse is correspondingly larger. The inverse covariance matrix is correspondingly larger, where the natural variability is small, right? So don't worry if you don't follow the details. The basic idea is just the following. The fingerprint is high, either where the signal pattern is strong. For example, CO2 gives a strong warming signal in the Arctic, or where internal variability is small. So if you're trying to fingerprint CO2, you're looking for either a large CO2 effect or a small natural variability contribution. And here's a more helpful diagram, which shows how the signal to noise ratio can change when you rotate the signal. So here's a signal. So let's say the CO2 effect has a certain spatial pattern. You can think of it as some vector, but let's imagine along that direction, the natural variability is high, right? The natural variability is a little high along the other direction. And so you rotate the signal. And so the optimal fingerprint will be found along this direction, where the natural variability is a little small. And the signal to noise ratio here, which is this distance, C minus Cn divided by Cn minus 0, will increase by some amount. And so this would be the optimal fingerprint. And here's a paper that applies this fingerprint idea. The top panel shows warming between two periods in the observations. The middle panel shows the fingerprint of greenhouse gases and aerosol-caused warming in a set of climate models. And the bottom panel is a difference. And what's the bottom panel? The bottom panel is just the best estimate. So another thing you get from this procedure is you get an estimate of how much of this change comes from natural variability. The right panel shows the corresponding globally averaged time series. The optimal fingerprint is clearly smoother, right? The optimal fingerprint is clearly smoother. This figure you see, there's much less spatial variability. It's much smoother than the observed pattern, right? The original data set, which describes the difference in temperatures between the two periods. And so the optimal fingerprint is smoother than the global warming signal and is basically a filtered version that allows you to see the broad scale effect of climate forces. Okay, and this has been applied to a whole bunch of examples of forcers and looking at the multivariate case, looking at optimal fingerprints across models and so on. People have applied it to understand as well the role of stratospheric warming this role of stratospheric cooling in providing a fingerprint of the CO2 effect on climate change. That's it from me. I'll stop here and we can take questions as well as move on to the interactive tutorial. So there's a question, what about microbial respiration? I think that will be included here in this budget. Have I missed any questions?
Yes, sir.
Are there any questions? Please go ahead.
No, sir, no.
Okay.
So,
any other questions? Yeah, please go ahead.
So how is the deep ocean affected with this carbon cycle?
Yeah, how does the deep ocean affect the carbon cycle? That's your question, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. In many ways, it turns out that the lifetime of CO2, if you were to think, naively, what's the lifetime of CO2? Right? The atmosphere has 750 petagrams of carbon, and the ocean takes up 92. If you divide the two, and you get roughly a 10-year lifetime, which is consistent with Revell's early finding, initial finding, that say radioactive carbon, right, a molecule of radioactive carbon ends up in the ocean within about 10 years. But that's not the end of the story, because we're interested in the net fluxes to the surface ocean, right? We're also interested in the time it takes, because the surface ocean gets saturated, so we're interested in the time it takes for the surface ocean to mix with the deep ocean. And it turns out that the largest pools of CO2 in the deep ocean have very long mixing times with the rest of the ocean. And that puts a lower limit on the lifetime of CO2. And that plays a very important role in this result that we saw. Okay, there's also the ocean carbonate cycle and so on, which I don't understand it, I'm not an expert in, but ocean chemistry plays a very important role in reducing the acidity of the oceans and allowing CO2 to mix into the oceans. Okay, the ocean also plays a role, right, through subduction of ocean sediments, right? It puts it back as fossil fuel carbon and then makes it available eventually for consumption by the carbon cycle in various ways. So there are many, many ways in which the ocean interacts with the carbon cycle. There's another way in which the ocean interacts with carbon cycle indirectly by providing a lot of inertia to the climate system. Okay, so a lot of the energy, as Professor J.S. discussed yesterday, a lot of the extra energy that comes from radiative forcing goes into the oceans, right? It's stored in the oceans. So even if we were to reduce CO2 emissions, right, and even after the radiative forcing comes down, as the concentrations of CO2 comes down, there's a lot of inertia in the temperature response, and that's because of thermal inertia of the oceans. And by providing thermal inertia to the climate system and reducing the rate at which the temperature can come down, it consequently also affects carbon cycle feedbacks because, for example, gas exchange between the atmosphere and the ocean is temperature dependent, right? If you have warmer surface waters, they can dissolve less CO2. Okay, so that's another feedback. That's a very uncertain climate feedback in the carbon cycle. Okay, so there are many, many ways in which the ocean plays a role. in the carbon cycle. Have I answered your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Sorry?
Yes, sir, I got it.
Yeah, okay, all right. Differences of observed minus model represents natural variability in the last slide. Yeah. So, no, okay, so this is not just natural variability, right? It's the observed minus the fingerprint. So this is the fingerprint. Okay, so this is the natural role of natural variability that contributes to the difference between the observed and the fingerprint. Right, so it's like this. C minus Cn, right, would be the second panel, and Cn would be the third. This vector corresponds to this third spatial pattern. Right, so in other words, if you rotate the signal to find a direction in which you can optimally find the fingerprint, what's the residual contribution? It's the residual contribution from natural variability along that direction. But yes, in a sense, it's the best estimate of natural variability, right? Which does not help you, which does not contribute to your fingerprint. Yeah, does that answer your question? Anyone else?
Can you please tell it again? How do we estimate the natural variability?
Okay,
Only
so natural variability comes from, yeah. So if you just want to know natural variability, what would you do? You would take a climate model, which has what's called a dynamic ocean, right? It gives you all the coupled ocean atmosphere modes of internal variability on various time scales. All right, and then you'd run the model with pre-industrial forcing. You won't add CO2.
So that is model generated value. That is not a observed thing, right?
It's not an observed thing. So you need models. And so we couldn't do, fingerprinting was a confluence of many things. It was a confluence of Hasselmann's ideas in the 70s and 80s on how to do this, together with developments in the 80s, where you had these dynamic oceans, which gave you reliable time series for the first time of natural variability. And you could get the time scales, you could get covariance matrices, you could build all the tools and apparatus that you needed to do this fingerprinting. But that's how you would, if you didn't care about fingerprinting, you just wanted to know natural variability. What would you do? You would run a model for a very long time without any forcing. Okay, and the model would have internal variability. That would be your estimate of natural variability. But this residual is different, right? It's not just...
Residual is always observed, right?
Yeah. It's in relation to the observed. There's a question, everything is related with nature. How can we segregate? CO2 is increasing in the sense some X is producing it, turned into CO2. How can we assess that X loss effect on climate change? Are you talking about the attribution problem? Are you asking how do we know that the CO2 is being produced by human activity? Is that the question? Or how do we know that CO2 is the cause of something? Yeah, is it a question about CO2? How do we know CO2 is from humans? How do we know that the CO2 is causing something, right? So how do we know CO2 is causing something? That's the fingerprinting problem, right? And yeah. So how do we know the CO2 is human? Well, combination of various, there are different lines of evidence. We know the natural CO2 cycle. We understand how it's being perturbed, right? And we know it's not going to be perturbed in this way without additional fossil fuel CO2. I also believe there is some, Professor Jace can maybe add to this. Is there an isotope signature of fossil fuel CO2 in the atmosphere?
Yes, Ashwin, there's a very nice discussion about carbon-14, which was produced during the atmospheric nuclear explosion in 1960s. Okay, and the fossil fuel carbon, it comes from deep inside the earth. It contains no carbon-14 because it's very old, right? It is 100 million years old. So as you burn more fossil fuel, it dilutes the amount of C14 in the atmosphere. So in the last 50 years, people are able to show that C14 produced during the bomb explosion in the 60s has reduced exactly by the amount by which humans burn fossil fuel. That is a remarkably accurate model that was done by physicists. So we are not able to fingerprint the role of human produced CO2, which is fossil fuel CO2.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor Jace. Yeah.
Yeah.
Does it answer your question? Thank you.
Yeah, Ashwin, I want to add one more thing. People should know that the fossil fuel we are burning has a different signature, fingerprint than the carbon produced by photosynthesis. That is the main message. They are not same. Fossil fuel photosynthesis occurs every year, and that carbon has a certain amount of various isotopes, while the fossil fuel carbon has a different isotopic signature, and we can differentiate between them very clearly.
Yes. Yes. Is it that it will have fossil fuel carbon will have less radioactive carbon because it's been produced, yeah, a long time ago? Thank you. There's a question, what about a practice like shifting cultivation, which involves multiple bouts of vegetation disturbance and recovery within a short span? I'm afraid I have no expertise to answer this. What do you have in mind? Your question is about the effect on the carbon cycle? Yes, yeah. I don't have anything to say. Well, the terrestrial carbon cycle is very complicated. All I would say is there's several very good people studying this. And you know, even if we don't think about human perturbation, right, or human modification, just understanding how we can, if we continue to do what we do and continue to manage the terrestrial vegetation the way we do, there are a lot of uncertainties about how the carbon cycle in the terrestrial vegetation will respond. So I don't know what that means for understanding, you know, perturbation or changes to practices like shifting cultivation. But this is definitely a very rich area of research. Anyone else? Okay, so if there are no questions, shall we invite my colleague Krishna to take over and begin the tutorial? Shall we take a quick break? Shall we take a 5-10 minute break and reconvene? Would you like to take a short break? Why don't we do that? Why don't we take a 5-10 minute break and come back, say at 3:20? Okay, please stay in the meeting, but we'll mute ourselves and we'll resume at 3:20.